grade 7 class. Today we're going to be discussing the food chain. So the curriculum connection here is that it's the grade 7 science and technology curriculum, strand B, interactions in the environment, and its specific expectations 3.3 and 3.4. The learning goals for today are that you'll be able to identify the roles of producers, consumers, and decomposers in an ecosystem, that you'll be able to describe the feeding interactions between a group of animals that I'll show you, and understand how the elimination of an organism might impact an ecosystem. So the success criteria are that you'll be able to accurately organize the sample of organisms into a food web, and you'll be able to correctly predict how the effect of losing one of those species might impact your ecosystem. So the agenda, first we'll discuss the different roles in the ecosystem, then we'll do a little activity that I've organized, and then we'll explain the food web and how you can make one. So the roles in an ecosystem. So there's three main roles. You have producers, consumers, and decomposers. So your producers are basically they're organisms that can take sunlight and turn it into biological energy. So these are basically your plants, and a few other things they like algae, for example. But for the most part, in a typical ecosystem, they're going to be your plants. Then you go on to consumers. So consumers are anything that gets their energy from eating another organism. So these can be in the form of primary consumers, which eat plants. So those are like your herbivores, or secondary consumers that eat animals that eat plants, or you can even go higher, like tertiary, which eats the second level, and so on. One of the big misconceptions with this primary and secondary consumers is that one is bigger than the other. So that primary consumers are small and secondary consumers are bigger. And that's not really so. You can have a primary consumer that's the size of a bison, or you can have it as small as a locust. And similarly with the secondary consumer, they can be small like a frog, or they can be big like a bear or a wolf. And then lastly, we have our decomposers. And these degrade and decay the dying matter in the ecosystem. So if a tree falls, or for example, then a fungus are a very common example of a decomposer, and they will decompose and decay that tree matter so that the matter in it can be recycled in the ecosystem. All right, so let's start our activity. On your table, you see there's a little bag of figures, so you can go ahead and open that. And the first thing I'd like you to do is organize those into producers, consumers, and decomposers.
Producer?
Yeah.
Consumer. I think that would be decomposer. Mushroom.
All right, so let's have a look. So you have your producer is the plant, your consumer is all the animals, and then your decomposer has the mushroom. So that's perfect. That's a perfect example of how we would organize those animals those organisms rather in an ecosystem. But what I want you to do now is further organize your consumers into primary and secondary consumers.
Bugs, right?
Yeah, that's what eat bugs.
That would sort of be both, because it would eat grains as well as small animals like bugs.
Yeah, I don't know where that one was.
So they're kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's have a look.
Primary, not sure, secondary.
Right, so you guys have a bit of a problem with the mouse, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so because this system of primary and secondary and tertiary consumers doesn't always work perfectly. They're not always at the same level. They might change depending on the context. So instead of organizing them in this sort of hierarchy, often what biologists will do is they'll organize them in what we call a food web. So a food web is a sort of graphic organizer of the relationships between these organisms. So I have a sample one here with just a few species. And you have your producers here on the bottom in the form of grass and wildflowers. You have your secondary consumers, your primary consumers in the rabbit and the mouse. The snake is a secondary, and the hawk is a tertiary. But you see what's interesting about this example food web is that the hawk will eat the rabbit and the snake. So even though these are primary, this is secondary, this is tertiary, there's interactions between the tertiary and the So I've prepared here a sheet of paper for you guys to make your own food web on. So if you just put the little figures over the labels, and then you can draw your own arrows. And remember, the arrow points to the thing that eats it. You're not pointing to what it eats, you point to the thing that eats it.
Okay.
That eats that?
I'd say beetle would eat plants.
Yeah.
Mouse eat plants.
Yeah. Mouse might eat the beetle.
Yeah. A mouse eat a frog. Oh.
It's small enough, big enough, maybe. Nope, not. That would be bad.
Yeah. So I go
Arrows up
Arrow
here.
up to it.
Yeah. It's the plant. Bison,
Yeah.
mouse.
I guess I could eat
And
a
the
mouse.
frog? Oh.
Oh.
Could definitely eat the mouse.
Okay, well,
And then the mushroom.
eat
decomposes.
everything.
All arrows lead to the mushroom.
How do we draw that?
Well, for now, just draw it for the plants, because that's
Okay.
really their main role is to decompose a lot of the tree matter.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Right, so let's have a look at your food web. It should look similar to the one I've prepared here. And it looks like it looks pretty much exactly the same. So you guys have done a great job. So what this allows us to do is really visualize the effect that removing one of these species might have. So if I were to take away one of your secondary consumers in the form of this wolf, how might that affect your ecosystem?
Well, I think there'd be too many bison and they'd eat all the plants. And then some of the other primary consumers would die off because they don't have enough food source.
Excellent. So one of the common misconceptions is that when you just take away a secondary consumer, that you just get more of the primary consumer. But it's really more than that, and you touched on it, because now that you have more primary consumers, they're then eating more producers, and it just has this this sort of trickle-down effect. It's not isolated to just that one incident. And you can see how removing different species might have different effects. So if I were to take away your producers, now, what kind of immediate impact would that have? Right? So it immediately would take away everything, because as I was saying at the beginning, your producers are the only organisms that are converting energy in the environment in the form of sunlight into biological energy, like sucrose and other sugars that these animals will need, the consumers need to grow and reproduce, and et cetera. So the producers have this enormous impact. And with the food web, you can sort of see with these arrows, and you can visualize how it might change an ecosystem. Okay. Cool. Were there any questions? No. All right. Excellent. So we'll pick it up. We'll pick it up next week.